Hi everybody, hope you're doing well. We are reading Taran Wanderer and we are on chapter 18. We only have 4 more chapters in this book, so we are moving right along. I hope you are enjoying it as much as I have. It's been a few years since I've read this book, so I'm enjoying reading it again. Chapter 18 is called The Free Commots. If you remember, Taran had a nice time at Lonio's home and now he's going out again on his way. From small Avron, they wended eastward at an easy pace, halting as it pleased them, sleeping on the turf or sheltering at one of the many farmsteads among the rich green vales. This was the land of the free Commots, of cottages clustering in loose circles, rimmed by cultivated fields and pastures. Taran found the Commot folk courteous and hospitable. Though he named himself only as Taran Wanderer, the dwellers in these hamlets and villages respected his privacy, and they asked nothing of his birthplace or rank or destination. Remember, these people are free people. They have no king or lord to rule them, and Taran's finding them to be very kind, very nice. They don't question who he is or where he's going. Taran and Gurgi had ridden into the outskirts of Commot Canarth when Taran reined up Melonlass at a long, low-roofed shed from which the sound of a hammer on an anvil rang. Within he found the smith, a barrel-chested, leather-aproned man with a stubby black beard and a great shock of black hair bristled as a brush. His eyelashes were scorched, grime and soot smudged his face. Sparks rained on his bare shoulders, but he seemed to count them no more than fireflies. In a voice like stones rattling on a bronze shield, he roared out a song in time with his hammer, stroked so loudly that Taran judged the man's lungs were as leathery as his bellows. So obviously we know about the blacksmith. This man is working at the blacksmith. Gurgi cautiously drew back from a shower of sparks. Taran called a greeting, scarcely able to make himself heard above the din. "Master Smith," he said, bowing deeply, as the man at last caught sight of him and put down his hammer. "I am called Taran Wanderer, and journey seeking a craft to help me earn my bread. I know a little of your art, and I ask you to teach me more. I have no gold or silver to pay you, but name any task, and I will do it gladly." So Taran says, "I'd like to learn from you. I'd like to be your apprentice. I'll do any other work around here that needs to be done." "Oh, away with you," shouted the smith. "Tasks I have aplenty, but no time for teaching others to do them." "Well, is time what lacks?" Taran said, glancing shrewdly at the smith. "I've heard it said that a man must be a true master of his craft, if he would teach it." "Hold!" roared the smith, as Taran was about to turn away. And he snatched up a hammer as if he meant to throw it at Taran's head. "You doubt my skill? I flattened a man on my anvil for less. Skill? In all the free Commots, none has greater than Hevid, son of Hirwas." With that, he seized the tongs and drew a bar of red-hot iron from the roaring furnace and flung it on the anvil and set to hammering it with such quick strokes that Taran could hardly follow the movement of Hevid's muscular arm. And suddenly there formed at the end of the bar a hawthorn blossom, perfect in every turn, from leaf to petal. So he created this flower, this budding flower out of metal, with leaves and everything, leaves and a stem and all. Taran looked at it in astonishment and admiration. "Never have I seen work so deftly done." "Nor will you see it anywhere else," Hevid answered, at pains to hide a proud grin. "But what tale do you tell me? You know about shaping metal? The secrets are not given to many. Even I have not gained all of them." Angrily he shook his bristly head. The deepest secrets lie hidden in Anuvian, stolen by Arwen the Death Lord. Lost they are, forever lost to Prydain. But here, take these, ordered the smith, pressing the tongs and hammer into Taran's hand. Beat the bar smooth as it was, and quickly now before it cools. Show me what strength you have in those little chicken wings of yours. Taran strode to the anvil, and as Coll had taught him long ago, he did his best to straighten the rapidly cooling iron. The smith, folding his huge arms, eyed him critically for a time, and then burst out into loud laughter. Enough, enough, cried Hevid. You speak the truth. Of the art, indeed, you know little. And yet, he added, rubbing his chin with a battered thumb nearly as thick as his fist, and yet, you have the sense of it. He looked closely at Taran. But you have the courage to stand up to the fire, to fight hot iron with only a hammer and tongs? Teach me the craft, Taran replied. You'll have no need to teach me courage. Boldly said, cried Hevid, clapping Taran on the shoulder. I'll temper you well in my forge. Prove yourself to me, and I'll vow to make a smith out of you. Now to begin with, his eye fell on Taran's empty scabbard. It seems once you carried a blade. Yeah, once I did, Taran answered, but it's long gone, and now I journey weaponless. Well, then you shall make a sword, commanded Hevid, and when you're done, you can tell me which is harder, smiting or smithing. So he says, when you're all done, you can tell me which is harder, fighting or being a blacksmith. To this, Taran learned the answer soon enough. The next several days were the most toilsome he'd ever spent. He thought at first the smith would set him up the work of shaping one of the many bars already in the forge, but Hevid had no such intention. What? Start when the work's already half done? Hevid snorted. No, no, my lad, you're going to forge a sword from beginning to end. Thus, the first task Hevid gave Taran was gathering fuel for the furnace, and from dusk to dawn, Taran stoked that fire until he saw a forge as a roaring, flame-tongued monster that could never eat to its fill. Even then, when the work had only begun, for Hevid would soon put him to shoveling in a very mountain of stones, then smelting out the metal they bore. By the time the bar itself was cast, Taran's face and arms were scorched and blackened. His hands were covered with more blisters than skin. His back ached. His ears rang with all the clank and clatter, with Hevid's voice shouting orders and instructions. Now Gurgi had offered to pump the bellows, and never faltered even when a cloud of sparks burst and flew into his shaggy hair, singeing it away in patches, until he looked as if a flock of birds had plucked him to make their nests. So Gurgi is pumping the bellows. It's a big pump that basically puts more oxygen on the fire to make it grow larger and larger. Life's a forge, cried the smith, as Taran, his brow streaming with sweat, beat the strip of metal. Yes, the hammer and the anvil too. You'll be roasted, smelted, and pounded, and you'll scarce know what's happening to you. But stand boldly to it. Metal's worthless until it's shaped and tempered. Despite the weariness that made him drop gratefully at the day's end into the straw pallet in the shed, Taran's heart quickened, and his spirits rose, as the blade little by little took shape on the anvil. The heavy hammer seemed to weigh more each time he lifted it. But at last, with a joyous cry, he flung it down and raised the finished sword, well wrought and balanced, gleaming brightly in the light of the forge. A handsome weapon, Master Smith, he cried, as fair as the one I carried. What then? Hevid exclaimed. Have you done your work so well? Would you trust your life to a blade untried? He flung out a burly arm toward a wooden block at the corner of the forge. Strike hard, he commanded. The flat, the edge, and the point. So now they have to test to see if this sword is going to be strong enough to hold. Proudly, Taran raised the sword high over his head, and he swung it down on the block. The weapon shuddered with the force of the blow. A sharp crack and clang smote his ears as the blade shattered and the shards went flying in all directions. So he just hit a wooden stump and it shattered. Taran shouted in dismay, and he could have wept as he stood there staring, disbelieving at the broken hilt. The broken hilt was still clutched in his hands. He turned and gave Hevid a despairing glance. "So-ho!" cried the smith, not at all distressed by Taran's wretched and rueful expression. "Did you think to gain a worthy blade on your first try?" He laughed loudly and shook his head. "Well, what am I going to do?" Taran cried, appalled at Hevid's words. "Do?" the smith retorted. "Well, what else is there to do but start anew?" And so they did. But this time, for Taran, there remained little of his joyous hopes. He labored grimly and doggedly, all the more dejected, when Hevid ordered him to cast aside 2 new blades he'd made, even before they were tempered, as he already judged them as flawed. The reek of the hot metal clung in his nostrils. It flavored even the food that he hastily swallowed each day. The billows of steam from the great, quenching tub choked him as if he were breathing clouds of scalding fog. The ceaseless din almost addled his wits, until he indeed felt as if he himself, not the blade, was being hammered. The next blade he shaped seemed ugly and dinted and scarred, but with fair proportions of the first, and this too he would have cast aside, had not the smith ordered him to finish it. "This may well serve," Hevid told him confidently, despite the doubtful look that Taran gave him. Again, Taran strode to that wooden block and raised the sword. Doing his best to shatter the ungraceful weapon, he brought it down with all his strength. The blade rang like a bell. This time, the block split in 2. "Now," said Hevid quietly, "that's a blade worth bearing." He clapped his hands and seized Taran's arm. "You've strengthened those chicken wings after all. You've proved yourself as well as you've proved the blade. Stay here, my lad, and I'll teach you everything I know." Taran said nothing for a time, but looked, not without pride, at his new forged blade. "You've already taught me so much," he said at last to Hevid, "though I lost what I'd hoped to gain. I'd hoped that indeed I was a swordsmith, but I've learned that I'm not." "How then?" cried Hevid. "You have the makings of an honest swordsmith, as good as any in Prydain." "It cheers me to think that might be true," Taran answered. "But I know in my heart that your craft is not mine. A spur drove me from the small river Avron, and it still drives me now. And so I must journey on, even if I wished to stay." The smith nodded his head. "You are well named, wanderer. So be it. I ask no man to go against his heart. Keep the blade as a token of our friendship. Yours it is more than any other, for you forged it with your own 2 hands. It's not a noble weapon, and thus it suits me all the more," Taran laughed, glancing at the ungainly sword. "Lucky it was that I didn't have to make a dozen before I got to it." "Luck?" snorted Hevid, as Taran and Gurgi took leave of him. "Not so. More labor than luck. Life's a forge, I say. Face the pounding, don't fear the proving, and you'll stand well against any hammer and anvil." So while Lonio talked about part of life being luck and having some luck and being hopeful for luck. Heavid saying, just that really hard work day after day after day is the key to life, and not fearing that either. With Heavid the smith waving a sooty hand in farewell, the companions traveled on, bearing northward along the rich valley of the great Avron. A few days of easy riding through pleasant countryside brought them to the edge of Commot Gwyneth. Here a shower suddenly began pelting on them, and the wayfarers galloped for the first shelter they could find. It was a cluster of sheds and stables, chicken roosts and storehouses, seeming to ramble in all directions. But as Taran dismounted and hastened to the cottage, amid the maze of buildings, he realized they were all linked together by covered walkways or flagstone paths, and whichever he followed would sooner or later have brought him to the doorway that opened almost before he knocked on it. "Come in, and a good greeting to you," called a voice crackling like twigs in a fire. As Gurgi scuttled inside to escape the teeming rain, Taran saw a bent old woman, cloaked in gray, beckoning him to the hearth. Her long hair was white as the wool on the staff that was hanging from her belt of plaited cords. Below her short girt robe, her bony shins looked thin and hard as spindles. A web of wrinkles covered her face. Her cheeks were withered, but for all her years, she gave no sign of frailty, as though time had only toughened and seasoned her, and her gray eyes were sharp and bright as a pair of new needles. So this is an older woman, but a very strong one. "I am Duvach, the weaver woman," she replied, as Taran bowed courteously and told her his name. "Taran Wanderer," she repeated with a tart smile. "From the look of you, I'd say you'd been indeed wandering, much more than you've been washing. And that's clear as the warp and weft on my loom." "Yes, yes," cried Gurgi. "See loom of weavings. See windings and bindings. So many it makes Gurgi's poor tender head swim with twirlings and whirlings." Taran, for the first time, noticed a high loom standing like a giant harp of 1,000 strings in a corner of the cottage. Around it were stacked bobbins of threads of all colors, and from the rafters dangled skeins of yarn, hanks of wool and flax, and on the walls hung lengths of finished fabrics, some of bright hues and simple designs, others of subtler craftsmanship and patterns more difficult to follow. Taran gazed astonished at the endless variety, and then he turned to the weaver woman of Gwyneth. "This calls for skills beyond anything I know," he said admiringly. "How is such work done?" "How?" the weaver woman chuckled. "It would take me more breath to tell you than you have ears to listen. But if you look, you shall see." And so saying, she hobbled to the loom, climbed onto the bench in front of it, and with surprising vigor began plying the shuttle back and forth, all the while working her feet on the treadles below, hardly pausing to even glance at her handiwork. At last she stopped and cocked her head at Taran, and she fixed him with her sharp gray eyes and said, "Thus it is done, wanderer, as all things are, each in its own way, thread by thread." Taran's amazement had grown all the more. "This I would gladly learn," he said eagerly. "The craft of the swordsmith was not mine. Perhaps the craft of the weaver may be. I pray you, will you teach it to me?" So he knows that Lonio's way, waiting for things to come to you, is not his way. He went to the blacksmith and decided that wasn't really his thing. Now he's fascinated by this weaver woman and what she can do. And so he's going to try to learn this. That I will, since you ask, replied Dwivach. But mind you, it's one thing to admire a well-woven bit of cloth, and another to sit yourself before the loom. My thanks to you, Taran exclaimed, for I don't fear to labor at your loom. With Heaven the smith, I didn't shrink from the hot iron or the flames of his forge, and a weaver's shuttle is a lighter burden than a smith's hammer. Oh, think you so? Dwivach added with a dry chuckle that sounded like knitting needles clicking together. Then what shall you weave to begin with? She went on, eyeing him sharply. Taran Wanderer, you call yourself? Taran Threadbare would be more like it. Would you weave yourself a new cloak? Thus you'll gain something to put on your back, and I'll see what skill you have in your fingers. Taran willingly agreed, but the next day, instead of teaching him weaving, Dwivach led the companions to one of her many chambers, which Taran saw full nearly to bursting with piles of wool. Tease out the thorns, pick out the cockleburs, the weaver woman ordered. Comb it and card it carefully. Wanderer, or when your cloak is done, it'll feel more like thistles instead of wool. So lots of little seeds and burrs and things get stuck in the sheep's wool, and after you shear it, you have to pick out all of the nasty seeds and thistles and things that are sharp and pointy in there. The size of the task ahead of Taran made him despair of ever finishing. But he and Gurgi started the painstaking work, and with Dwivach herself lending a hand. The aged weaver woman, Taran soon learned, had not only a tart tongue but a keen eye. Nothing escaped her. She spied the smallest knot, speck, or flaw, and she would bring this to Taran's attention with a sharp rap from her distaff to his knuckles. So this is a pretty strict little old lady, and by a tart tongue, they mean that she can kind of snap at him or, use her words to kind of get him to do what she wants. And she raps him on the knuckles if he doesn't do something right. But what smarted Taran more than the distaff was to learn that Dwivach, despite all of her years, could work faster, longer, and harder than he could himself. At the end of each day, Taran's eyes were bleary, his fingers were raw, his head nodded wearily. Yet the old weaver woman was as bright and spry as if the day had scarcely begun. Nevertheless, the work was at last finished. But now Dwivach set him in front of a huge spinning wheel. The finest wool is useless until it's spun into thread, the weaver woman told him. So you'd best begin by learning that as well. But spinnings are woman's toils, Gurgi protested. No, spinnings are not fitting for bold and clever weaver men. Well, indeed, snorted Dwivach. Then sit you down and learn otherwise. I've heard men complain of doing women's work, and women complaining of doing man's work, she added, fastening her bony thumb and forefinger to Gurgi's ear and marching him to a stool beside Taran. But I've never heard the work complain who's doing it, so long as it gets done. She has a good point there, right? There's no such thing as women's work and men's work. It's just work that needs to be done. So she grabs Gurgi by his ear and sits him on the stool. And so, under Dwivach's watchful eye, Taran and Gurgi spun the thread and filled the bobbins during the next few days. So you work on the spinning wheel to put that wool then onto a bobbin, which is like a little spindle, to get it all kind of wound around that. And then you can use that then to put it into your loom. So it's a lot of hard work, a lot of steps. Chastened by Dwivach's words, Gurgi did his best to help, though all too often the hapless creature managed only to tangle himself in the long strands. Next, Dwivach took the companions to a shed where pots of dye bubbled over a fire. Here Taran fared no better than Gurgi, for when the yarn was at last dyed, he was bespattered from head to toe in different colors. and Gurgi himself looked like a rainbow, suddenly sprouted hair. Not until all the other tasks were done, to Dwevach's satisfaction, did she take Taran to a weaving room, and there his heart sank, for the loom stood bare and stark as a leafless tree. "How then?" clucked the weaver woman as Taran gave her a rueful glance. "The loom must be threaded. Did I not tell you? All things are done step by step, strand by strand." So the loom is this big, place where they can start the weaving, but it has to have the rows of threads, and it's not even threaded. So Taran's like, "Oh my gosh, I can't even start yet because the loom's not even ready." "Heaven the smith told me that life was a forge," Taran sighed as he laboriously tried to reckon the countless threads needed. "And I think I'll be well-tempered before my cloak is finished." "Life's a forge, huh?" said the weaver woman. "I think life's a loom, rather, where lives and days intertwine. And wise is he who can learn to see the pattern. But if you mean to have a new cloak, you'd better work more and chatter less. Or did you hope for a host of spiders to come and do the labor for you?" Even after deciding on the pattern and threading the loom, Taran still saw only a hopeless, confusing tangle of threads. The cloth was painfully slow in forming, and at the end of a long day, he had little more than a hand's breadth of fabric to show for all his work. So he's only got about a hand's worth of this cloak in terms of little strip that long. So that's not very much. "Did I ever think a weaver's shuttle a light burden?" Taran sighed. "It feels heavier than the hammer and tongs and anvil all put together." So Taran's learning that this weaving is even harder than the blacksmith's work. It's not the shuttle that burdens you," answered Dwevach, "but the lack of skill, a heavy burden, wanderer. Is the only thing that can lift." "Well, what secret is that?" Taran cried. "Teach it to me now, or my cloak will never get done." But Dwevach only smiled. "The skill is patience, wanderer. As for teaching it, that I cannot do. It is both the first thing and the last thing you must learn for yourself." Taran gloomily went back to work, sure he would be as ancient as Dwevach before finishing the garment. Nevertheless, as his hands became used to the task, the shuttle darted back and forth like a fish among the reeds, and the cloth grew steadily on the loom. Though Dwevach was satisfied with his progress, Taran, to his own surprise, was not. "The pattern," he murmured, frowning, I don't know, somehow it just doesn't please me." "Now then, wanderer," replied Dwevach, "no man put a sword to your throat. The choice of the pattern was your own." "That it was," Taran admitted, but now that I see it so closely, I would rather choose another." "Ah ha ha," said Dwevach with a dry chuckle. "In that case, you have but one of two things to do. Either finish a cloak you'll be ill content to wear, or unravel the whole thing and start anew, for the loom weaves only the pattern that's set upon it." Taran stared a long time at his handiwork. At last he took a deep breath, sighed, and shook his head. "So be it. I'll start anew." We've all had that art project where we started doing something and then we were like, "Oh, this is all wrong. I'm just going to start all over again." And that's hard to do. Over the next few days, he ruefully unthreaded and rethreaded the loom. But after that it was ready and he began weaving once again. He was delighted to find the cloth growing faster than it had ever done before, and his spirit rose with his newfound skill. When the cloak was at last done, he held it up proudly. "This is far better than I had," he cried, "but I doubt I'll ever be able to wear a cloak again without thinking of every thread on it." Gurgi shouted triumphantly, and Dwevach bobbed her head in approval. "Well woven," she said. Her expression had lost much of its tartness, and she looked fondly at Taran, seeming to smile within herself. "You have skills in your fingers, wanderer," she said with unaccustomed gentleness. "Enough skill to make you one of the finest weavers in all of Prydain. And if my distaff and your knuckles met more often than you'd like, it was only because I deemed you worthy of reproving. Dwell in my house if you choose, and work at my loom, and what I know, I will teach you." Taran did not answer immediately. As he hesitated, the weaver woman smiled and spoke again. "I know what's in your heart, wanderer," she said. "A young man's way is restless, yes, and a young girl's too. I'm not so gone in my years that I've forgotten. Your face tells me that it is not your wish to stay in Commots. Taran nodded his head. "As much as I'd hoped to be a swordsmith, so I hope to be a weaver. But you speak the truth. This is not the way that I would follow." "Well, then we must say farewell," answered the weaver woman. "But, mind you," she added in her usual sharp tone, "if life is a loom, the pattern you weave is not always so easily unraveled." So true, she says, in life we make lots of choices, and we can't always easily undo them as we can when we're making a weaving. So, just another little life lesson Taran's picking up. So Taran and Gurgi set off again, still journeying northward, and soon Commots was far behind them. Though Taran wore his new cloak on his shoulders and his new blade at his side, his pleasure in them shortly gave way to disquiet. The words of Duavach lingered in his mind, and his thoughts turned to another loom in the distant marshes of Morva. "And what of Ordu?" he said. "Does she weave with more than threads? The robin has truly been scratching for his worms. But have I indeed chosen my own pattern? Or am I no more than a thread on her loom? If that's so, then I fear it's a thread serving little purpose. Well, at any rate," he added with a rueful laugh, "it's a long and tangled one." So now he's wondering to himself, does Ordu is she weaving my life right now? Is that loom that she's weaving? Is it everyone's journey and all the actions that happen, all the things that happen? And am I merely a thread on that loom that she's controlling, or am I controlling my destiny and my life? But these gloomy thoughts flew from his mind when some days later Melonlas bore him to the top of a rise, and he looked down on the fairest Commot that he'd ever seen. A tall stand of firs and hemlock trees circled the broad, well-tended fields that were green and abundant. White thatched roof cottages sparkled in shafts of sunlight. The air itself seemed different here to him, cool and touched with a sharp scent of evergreens. His heart quickened as he watched, and strange excitement filled him. Gurgi had ridden up beside him. "Kindly master, can we not stop here?" "Yes," Taran murmured, his eyes never leaving the fields and cottages. "Yes, here we shall rest." He urged Melonlas down the slope, with Gurgi cantering eagerly behind him. Crossing a shallow stream, Taran reined up at the sight of a hale old man digging busily near the water's edge. Beside him stood a pair of wooden buckets on a yoke, and into these he carefully poured spadesful of brown, pale earth. His iron-gray hair and beard were cropped short. Despite his age, his arms seemed as brawny as Hebed the smith. So again, this is an older gentleman, but he's got super strong arms. He's down by the riverbank. The yoke is that wooden kind of a beam that you'd put between your shoulders to carry 2 buckets at the same time and kind of share the weight of those buckets. I'm sure you've seen it. They would put it both on animals sometimes and also on your own shoulders to carry buckets to make them. It's easier to do that than to carry them with your arms, which pulls on your shoulders so much. A good greeting to you, Master Delver, Taran cried. What place is this? The man turned and wiped his deeply lined brow with his forearm, and he looked at Taran with keen blue eyes. The water your horse is standing in, and churning to mud, by the way, is Fenbrake Stream. The Commot? This is Commot Marin. And that's the end of chapter 18. Thanks for listening, everybody. Taran's learned a lot of new skills. We'll see what skill he learns next. He's also learned a lot of life lessons, too, which is helpful.